This recording is one of two that serve as an overview of the OneCore core transact setup and configuration. I'll be covering the base configuration required before one can commence with financial product creation and contract creation. So setup is primarily grouped into logical areas for product, transactions, calculations, and drawdowns. Under the product section, we have setups to define the product status, the product types, the product groups, and then defining product rule sets. So if I have a look at product statuses, these are the various states that within the product life cycle that could be assigned to a product. Similarly, under product types, we've created several types of products: developmental finance, revolving, and unsecured. Under groups, we've created a business and consumer group. So these are all grouping fields that can be appended to the product header and then used for reporting or to drive process. If you move on to the product rule sets. So a rule set is a collection of filtering criteria that is associated with one or more products to aid with risk-based product allocation during the origination process. So one can define several rule sets as illustrated within the top pane. So for example, if I'm looking at an agri-loan rule set, I can then for each rule set define several attributes, or call it lines, where each attribute represents a unique combination of value ranges or explicit string values. So these columns are explicit numerical fields that have been defined. These are completely configurable, and these values serve obviously as the filters. So it's best explained via example. So if I define my filters to be 3 scores, and these could be anything. Let's just assume that score 1 is called Empirica. I have a minimum and a maximum. The second score is a Beacon score, a minimum and a maximum, and the third score is a Delphi, which is a minimum and maximum. If I then gather information within my origination process that states that score 1 equals 100, score 2 equals 100, and score 3 equals 100, then we'll find a match in line 1, and we could then allocate a maximum facility value exposure for product of $1 million. Similarly, if the number we gathered along the way was 200, well, 200 falls into this range here for score 1, score 2, and score 3. And then in that particular instance, we would then allocate a facility maximum value of 2 million. So this is a great way to be able to gather information along the way, i.e. in the origination process, and then using this information to only present the products that are ideally suited to the applicant based on the information provided up until this point. If we move on to transactions, we have transaction types. Now, transaction types are what you utilize within your contract ledger, and this is where one would define your GL integration. So here is your posting profile, for example. Probably more important is the transaction setup. And transaction setups, we may need to edit that out. Probably more important is your transaction setup. Now, transaction setups would be viewed as an instance of the transaction type with additional transaction behavior. So here's where you define your transaction behavior. Okay, let me edit that out. So more important is your transaction setup. So your transaction setup should be viewed as an instance of your transaction types with additional transaction behaviors that can be defined. So for example, this particular transaction can be defined to be balance affecting. It may not be arrears affecting. It may have an induplum calculation associated with it, and so on and so forth. If I focus on receipts, for example, this transaction type, we could create several receipt transaction types, each with different behaviors, but all can share the same underlying transaction type where the ledger posting profiles are defined. If we move on to calculations, edit that one out, calculation setup. So calculations are user-defined, and they can be associated with a fee or interest calculation. We can have several fees, and I'm including interest in this together with fees, and then associate this calculation with each one of these fees. So when the fees are then processed, it utilizes the logic defined within the associated calculation to derive the output. So for example, if I go down to unsecured interest calculation type, it states that if the contract balance, let me just highlight this, that if the contract balance is greater than 0, then we would apply an index rate plus 20%. Otherwise, or else, apply nothing. And I'll get to how we manage index rates a little bit later in this demonstration. So effectively, contracts with credit balance in this particular scenario will not accrue any interest. We then define if the output must be treated as a percentage or if it must be output as numeric. And then we validate if there are any errors within the defined formula. So we'll go to the validation section and we'll validate if this is indeed, if it's passed correctly, meaning that there's no errors within this formula, we would then, this calculation will be available for selection throughout the system. Your formulas can comprise of variables, and they can be defined to look up a value within a database, or they can be constants. So the calc engine has a wealth of built-in functions, and there's also an extendable framework to add anything that does not currently exist within its bank. So we found this to be extremely empowering to enable product specialists rather than them having to rely on extensive IT development cycles. Contract events. So there's not too much to describe here other than this being a place to define one's contract events that can then be used as triggers for fees and interest. If we move on to drawdowns, I'll focus on drawdown categories as a first port of call. This is where you define the disbursement categories and groupings. So it's best explained by example. So take note of the various disbursement categories that we have here. We have accommodation, books, labor, machinery, seed, and services. We can then associate each one of these to a group, define the maximum disbursement percentage for each one of these categories, and then assign the group to a product. So let me go step out here and let me show you what we're referring to. So here's a particular group. So we've defined an education group. So let me go into the drawdown categories, drawdown groupings, to clarify what I mean. We have an education group, and what we've done is we've associated accommodation, drawdown category, and books. And what we have then done is we've said, well, for this particular drawdown group, we don't expect there to be anything more than 50% of the facility value to be allocated to accommodation and 50% to books. We would then associate that with a particular product, and then this product is used, when this product is used, the disbursements will be governed according to the associated categories. So I just want to touch on interest rates, and I did mention this earlier in the presentation that I wanted to touch on how we manage interest rates. So these rates are effective dated, meaning that we have version control if the rates change over time. So in this particular instance, we have a prime lending rate defined. We have a repurchase interest rate as well. So we have defined this as 6.5%, and this may change over time. What we can do is, if there were several versions of this repurchase rate, we could see or display all records, and all of them would be displayed here if there were several versions of this. Now, the benefit of this is, or at least the power of this, that we're managing versions. So if we're processing a retrospective transaction, the appropriate interest rate will be applied for the retrospective period from the transaction date through to present. Right, so in conclusion, I've covered the base configuration required for one to commence with financial product creation and contract creation.